The ladder shifted the moment her cloth touched the frame, and Mercy Fenwick felt the whole world tip sideways along with it. She had climbed to the top rung 100 times before, always with one hand braced on the gilt edge of the portrait, and the other sweeping the dust from Lady Halworth's painted shoulder. And the gallery had never once betrayed her. It betrayed her now. The rung gave a groan she had never heard it give, and her stomach dropped before her body did. And she had just enough breath to think that Mrs. Prewitt would be furious about the broken crockery of her, laid out on the gallery floor among 3 generations of dead earls, when a hand closed hard around her waist and stopped her fall 3 inches from the boards. For a moment, neither of them moved. She hung there, one slipper lost somewhere behind her, her heart going like a fist against a locked door, and became aware, in pieces, of the arm that held her. It was a soldier's arm, she thought distantly, hard through the wool of a greatcoat that smelled of horse and cold road, and it did not shake at all, though it had just caught the full weight of a falling housemaid without warning. He set her down, with a care that surprised her more than the catching had. He did not release her at once. He looked at her the way no one at Halworth Park had looked at her in the 11 months she had scrubbed its floors, directly, as though she were a person, and not a piece of the furniture that came with the house. And she saw something move behind his eyes that she could not yet name. It was Mrs. Prewitt, hurrying in with her keys still jangling, who named him for her. "Your Grace," she said, and then caught herself flustered. "My lord, we had not looked for you until Thursday." He was the Earl. He had been a captain in Spain a season ago, and was an Earl now, because his father had died in October, and his elder brother had died of a fever in November, and the whole house had spent 2 months in black preparing for a homecoming. Nobody had truly believed would come this soon. Mercy retrieved her slipper and her composure at roughly the same moment, dropped a curtsy that felt entirely inadequate to the circumstance, and would have fled the gallery entirely if a second voice had not arrived first, from the doorway, cool and already displeased. "Ah, the girl who dusts," Edmund Vane said, looking at her the way one looks at a smear on a window. "I did wonder what the commotion was. My lord, you must forgive the household its rough edges. We have been managing without a firm hand since your father's passing." Nathaniel Ashworth, 9th Earl of Halworth, said nothing to that for a long moment. He looked instead at the portrait Mercy had been climbing toward, his father's late wife rendered in oils above the mantle of ancestors, her painted mouth caught in the small private smile she must have worn for the artist, and no one else. Something crossed his face, quick, and locked away again before Mercy could read it fully. Then he looked back at her, at the maid still catching her breath against the gallery wall, and inclined his head with a courtesy that had nothing performed in it. "I am obliged to you for not falling," he said. "Both of us, I think." He did not yet know what waited behind that painting. Neither did she. She only knew, walking back down to the kitchens with her cloth still balled in one fist and her pulse still unsteady, that something in the house had shifted the moment his hand closed around her waist, the way a house settles before a storm, quietly, in its bones, long before the first drop of rain. If a story that begins on a falling maid and a soldier's steady arm is the kind that keeps you close until the end, you are already the sort of listener this one was written for. Settle in. There is more behind that portrait than dust. The Halworth Park that Mercy had come to 11 months earlier was not the house she had grown up admiring from the lane. Her father had been the estate's land steward for 19 years, a careful, well-liked man who kept the tenant ledgers in a hand so neat the old Earl used to joke that Thomas Fenwick wrote his figures like a man courting them. He had died in the spring before last of a chest complaint that took him in 11 days, and within a season the new steward Edmund Vane had found irregularities in 19 years of those careful ledgers that no one had thought to question while he lived. There was no money to dispute it with. There was a widow with a weak heart, gone within the year of grief more than illness, and a girl of 21 left to raise her 10-year-old brother on whatever wages a household would give a steward's disgraced daughter. Halworth Park gave her a maid's wages, because the old Earl himself had insisted upon it before his death, over Vane's objections, on the grounds that the sins of the ledger were not the sins of the child. It was, Mercy had come to understand, the last kindness the old man had performed as master of his own house, and she had never had the chance to thank him for it. He had died 3 weeks after she began, quietly, in his sleep. Before she had done more than dust his portrait and carry his mourning tray twice. Mrs. Prewitt had taken her aside her first week, not unkindly, and told her plainly how the house stood. "Keep your head down, girl," she had said. "Keep your hands busy, and your opinions to yourself. And above all, keep your father's name out of your mouth, because there are those under this roof who would be glad of an excuse to be rid of a Fenwick, and you will not give them one by accident if you can help it." Mercy had taken the counsel to heart the way she took most hard counsel, without complaint, and without forgetting a word of it. She rose before the rest of the house, laid the morning fires, carried water, scrubbed the stone passage floors on her knees until her knuckles cracked in the cold, and saved whatever silence the work allowed her for thoughts of Tom, and of her mother's garden gone to weed behind the cottage, and of a father whose good name she could not defend from a scullery passage, no matter how badly she wished to. The gallery had become, in time, the 1 hour of her day she did not begrudge. It was quiet before the house woke, and cold, and full of dead Ashworths who asked nothing of her beyond a clean cloth and a steady hand, and she had grown fond of it in the plain, unsentimental way one grows fond of any solitude that does not have to be shared or explained. She had never once, in 400 mornings, expected the gallery to give her anything back. She kept her brother Tom fed, and in shoes from her wages, and whatever mending she could take in on her one free evening, and she kept her father's name out of her mouth entirely, because Mrs. Prewitt had warned her early that Vane liked nothing better than an excuse to be rid of a Fenwick under this roof. She dusted the gallery every morning before the family rose. She had dusted Lady Halworth's portrait, in particular, 400 times or more, because it hung nearest the light and gathered soot fastest, and she had long ago stopped seeing the woman in it as anything but a chore with a gilt frame. She did not know, climbing that ladder for the 401st time, that the portrait had been the last thing the old Earl touched before he died, or that the touching had not been sentiment alone. The house she returned to that afternoon was a house holding its breath. The new Earl's arrival 3 days early had thrown every plan into disorder. Mrs. Prewitt fretting over airing his rooms and confirming the morning black had not gone dusty in storage. Vane closeted with him for 2 hours in the estate office with the ledgers Mercy's father had once kept, and Cordelia Fairfax, who had been staying at Halworth Park as the Dowager Countess's particular guest since All Saints, appearing at the top of the stairs in a gown the exact green of new money, and asking, in the bright, carrying voice she used for anything she wished overheard, whether it was true the Earl had come home to find his own house run by servants and steered by his aunt's steward rather than himself. Mercy heard it from the corridor below, where she was carrying linen, and did not think it concerned her at all. She had not yet learned how much of the coming winter would. That evening, Nathaniel Ashworth stood at the library window, with a glass of his father's brandy he had not touched, and looked out at a park he had not seen in 3 years, and found he did not recognize it. Not the grounds. Those were the same bare oaks and gray stone he had known since boyhood. He did not recognize the weight of the place, the particular silence a house keeps when it has been managing grief without him for 2 months, while he was still crossing the Bay of Biscay unaware his father was already gone. He had written to his father twice from Spain that autumn, careful letters full of small news meant to bridge 3 years of a silence neither of them had chosen to break first. Neither letter had been answered. He told himself, standing at the window, that the war had swallowed the Post the way it swallowed everything else, and did not yet let himself wonder if the truth was worse than that. Vane had given him the ledgers, the will, the accounts, all of it laid out with the smooth competence of a man who had managed a great house alone and wished his new master to notice the management. The will was his father's, drawn 4 years prior, entirely conventional, leaving Hallworth Park and its encumbrances to his eldest surviving son. His brother James had held that place for 2 months before the fever took him. Now it was Nathaniel's, and Vane's careful accounting of debts and rents and a mortgage his father had apparently taken against the North Farms sat on the desk waiting for his signature on documents that would, among other things, confirm Vane's continued management and finalize an understanding, already spoken of at dinner as though settled, that the new Earl would marry Miss Fairfax before the season's end and steady the family's fortunes with her considerable one. He had said nothing to that at dinner beyond a civil word. He was thinking, instead, of the maid on the ladder, and of the look on his father's painted wife's face, and of a small, strange thing Vane had mentioned in passing that afternoon, that his father had spent the better part of his last conscious week alone in the gallery with that portrait, refusing even Mrs. Prewitt's company, for reasons no one in the house had ever explained. Nathaniel did not believe, yet, that the reason mattered. He would. The dismissive label found its second voicing 3 weeks later at a dinner the Dowager Countess held to welcome her grandson home properly, with the county's better families seated the length of the long table and Mercy stationed by the sideboard to refill glasses, a duty she had not held before and would not have chosen. Cordelia, midway through a story about a modiste in Bath, paused only long enough to hand Mercy her empty glass without looking at her, and remark to the table at large that one hardly noticed the girl at all, which was, she supposed, precisely what one wanted from that sort of maid, the kind with ideas above a duster and nothing beneath them to justify the ideas. The table laughed, mildly, the way tables do at nothing in particular. Mercy kept her eyes on the decanter and her hand steady, and did not let her face show what the words had cost her, because she had learned in 11 months exactly how much a servant's visible feeling was permitted to cost a household its comfort. Nathaniel, 3 seats down, did not laugh. He watched the girl's hands, perfectly steady around the crystal, and thought of the latter, and said nothing, because there was nothing yet he could say that would not make her evening worse, rather than better. He caught her eye once, by accident, and something passed between them that had no name, and lasted less than a second. And Cordelia, watching him watch the maid, filed the moment away with the same careful attention she gave everything that might later prove useful. That was the second time. There would be a third, though none of them knew it yet, and it would come at the worst possible hour. The witnessing came in the second week of December, on an afternoon Nathaniel had meant to spend entirely on the North Farm accounts, and instead spent standing very still in the doorway of the estate schoolroom, where he had gone looking for a missing ledger, and found instead his own housemaid on her knees beside the hearth, coaxing a fire back to life for a boy who was not supposed to be there. Tom Fenwick was small for 10, quick-eyed, and plainly terrified of being discovered, which told Nathaniel at once that this was not the first time his sister had smuggled him in from the cold to sit by a schoolroom fire while she worked, rather than leave him alone in the cottage they could no longer properly heat. Mercy was reading to him from a battered primer, patient through his stumbles, correcting nothing harshly, praising everything she honestly could. When the boy finally sounded out a whole sentence unaided, she did not clap or exclaim. She simply went still, and looked at him with a fierce, quiet pride that had nothing performed in it at all, and said, "Well done, Tom. Your father would have been proud of that." Nathaniel withdrew before either of them saw him, and stood afterward in the cold corridor for longer than the moment strictly required, turning over what he had watched. He had been raised among people who performed goodness loudly, who gave to charity where it would be seen, and forgave where forgiveness would be admired. He had never before watched someone be good where no one was meant to be watching at all. He found Vane that same afternoon, and asked, with a mildness that cost him some effort, why a steward's orphaned children were kept from the estate schoolroom that every tenant's child had free use of. Vane's answer was smooth and entirely reasonable, and satisfied Nathaniel not at all. He said nothing further about it. He did, the following morning, tell Mrs. Prewitt that the boy was to be allowed the schoolroom fire whenever his sister's duties required it, and that the instruction had come from him directly, and was not to be revisited. Mercy learned of it from Mrs. Prewitt, who delivered the news with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had watched a great deal and said little. Mercy did not know what to make of a new master who noticed a schoolroom fire before he had finished settling his own father's affairs. She told herself it meant nothing beyond ordinary decency, and found, dusting the gallery the next morning, that her hand lingered rather longer than usual on the frame of the portrait he had been looking at so strangely the day he arrived. She did not yet know why he looked at it that way. She was about to learn that neither, entirely, did he. The first hard frost of the year caught Mercy on the lane between the cottage and the great house, 3 evenings after the schoolroom fire, walking home later than she had meant to, after Tom's lesson ran long, with no cloak thick enough for the cold that had come down sudden and complete with the dark. She did not hear the horse until it was nearly upon her. She heard, instead, her own name, spoken sharply enough to stop her mid-step, and turned to find the Earl himself dismounted in the lane, leading his horse by the bridle, his greatcoat already half off his shoulders before she had finished turning. "Take this," he said, and it was not a request. He settled the coat around her shoulders himself, his hands brief and impersonal at her collar, and did not wait for her protest before he had begun walking beside her, leading the horse at a slow pace, matched to her steps rather than his own. "You will not walk this lane again after dark without a lantern," he said. "I do not care whose lesson ran long. Send word to the house and a groom will bring you home." She told him, because pride would not let her accept the coat, without at least attempting to refuse it, that she had walked the lane 100 times before he ever came home from Spain, and had never yet frozen to death upon it. He did not answer that directly. He only glanced at her, once, in the last gray light, and said that 100 safe crossings did not make the 101st one certain, and that he would rather be thought over-careful than explain to her brother why his sister had not come home. They walked the remainder of the lane in a silence that was not, she found, uncomfortable. She was aware of him beside her in a way she could not have explained to Mrs. Prewitt or to herself, aware of the warmth of his coat still holding the shape of his shoulders, aware of how close his hand rode to hers on the horse's bridle, without ever once closing the distance between them. Twice she thought he meant to speak, and did not. Once, at the gate, his hand rose as though to steady her over the icy step, and stopped an inch short of her arm, and hung there a moment before he let it fall, and she understood, without a single word passing between them, that he had wanted to touch her, and had chosen, deliberately, not to. "I am obliged to you, my lord," she said, handing back the coat at the kitchen door, because it was the only safe thing left to say. "Keep it a moment longer," he said. "You are still shaking." She was not shaking from the cold by then, and suspected, from the low, careful way he said it, that he knew as much. She went in all the same, and hung the coat on its peg rather than her own, and stood a long while in the scullery passage with her heart going faster than the walk alone could account for, turning over the particular ache of wanting a thing she had no right to want, and no notion of how to stop wanting. The letter arrived folded inside an old account book Nathaniel had finally located in his father's writing desk, in December's third week, in his father's own hand, dated the September before his death, and addressed to no one, as though the old Earl had begun it 100 times and finished it only once he had stopped expecting to send it. He wrote of James first, of pride he had never said aloud to either son, because he had been raised by a father who considered saying such things a weakness, and of a bitter regret that he had let 3 years of Nathaniel's silence pass unanswered, rather than write first and risk being refused. He wrote, further in, of his land steward of 19 years, dead that spring, and of a suspicion that had come to him too late, that the irregularities Vane had found in the ledgers were not what they appeared, that a man who had served him faithfully for 2 decades did not become a thief in his final winter without some other hand at work in it. He wrote that he intended to look into the matter properly once his health improved, and that in the meantime he could not in conscience leave the Fenwick children to bear a dead man's unproven disgrace on his own estate. The letter ended mid-sentence. There was no third page. Whatever provision the old Earl had meant to make, whatever correction to the ledgers or the will he had intended, had died with him before the pen finished the thought, or else existed somewhere Nathaniel had not yet found it. He sat a long while with that unfinished page in the lamplight, and understood at last why his father had spent his final lucid week alone with a painted portrait, rather than with his family. A man does not confess his failures to the living when the living are the ones he has failed. He confesses them to the dead, or to something that resembles the dead closely enough to bear the weight of it. If you have ever found a piece of the truth folded inside something ordinary, a letter, a ledger, a drawer that should have held nothing, you already know the particular cold that runs through a room when it happens. Nathaniel felt it now, sitting alone with his father's unfinished sentence, and did not yet know how much colder the house was about to become before it grew warm again. He went to the gallery that same night with a candle and stood before his stepmother's portrait for a long while, searching its gilt frame for anything a grieving old man might have thought to hide there, and finding nothing his eye alone could locate. He told himself he was imagining meaning where there was none. He did not yet know that the girl who dusted that frame every morning had, twice now, felt something shift faintly beneath the canvas backing when her cloth pressed too hard along the lower edge, and had dismissed it both times as nothing more than an old frame settling with the winter cold. The dark moment arrived on the coldest morning of the year, 3 days before Christmas, when Vane called Mercy into the estate office and informed her, with the same smooth reasonableness he brought to everything unpleasant, that her position at Hallworth Park was to be terminated at the quarter's end, on the grounds that a household preparing for its new earl's marriage required staff of unimpeachable character, and that a steward's daughter under a cloud of suspicion no longer answered to that description. Mercy asked, as steadily as she could manage, what suspicion? Precisely. Still attached to a matter closed a year and a half before her father was in his grave to answer it. Vane's answer was that certain figures had lately come to light suggesting the irregularities ran deeper than first believed, figures he would be obliged to bring before the new earl directly, unless Mercy chose to spare her brother's memory of their father a public airing by removing herself from the estate quietly before Christmas, without the wages owed her for the quarter. She asked whether the new earl himself had seen these figures. Vane said that he had not yet had occasion to trouble his lordship with so small a household matter, and smiled faintly, in a way that told her exactly how small he intended to keep it for as long as he was able. She asked what would become of Tom if she left without a character and without wages, in the dead of winter, with nowhere in the county willing to take a steward's disgraced daughter into service. Vane said that was, regrettably, not a difficulty of his making, and gathered his papers as though the matter were already closed, as though a girl's whole winter could be folded away as neatly as a ledger. She did not weep in front of him. She had promised herself, the week her mother died, that he would never again see what his words cost her. And she held to that promise now, with everything her pride had left, and thanked him, with a composure that felt like glass under her ribs, for informing her plainly, rather than leaving her to hear it from the servants' hall. She left the office with her composure intact, and her hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her skirts in the corridor before she could trust herself to walk. It was there, in that corridor. With her back against the cold stone and her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall where anyone might see them, that she heard the third voicing, Mrs. Prewitt's low, furious report to the cook in the passage beyond, that Mr. Vane had been overheard telling Miss Fairfax not an hour past that the Fenwick girl was nothing, a servant with a dead thief for a father, and the sooner she and her brother were off the estate, the sooner this house could put the whole shabby business behind it. Nothing, Mercy thought, standing very still in the cold corridor. She had been called a nobody, a girl above her station, a smear on a window, and now, at last, nothing at all. She thought of her father's careful ledgers, and her mother's last frightened winter, and her brother sounding out whole sentences by a borrowed fire, and found that the word did not fit any of it, and could not for the life of her think how to prove that to a house that had already decided. She did not go to Nathaniel. It did not occur to her that a maid facing dismissal had any standing to appeal to an earl 3 weeks in his own house, and she would not, in any case, have used what little proximity had grown between them to beg for her place. She went instead that afternoon to the one task still hers to finish, and climbed the gallery ladder one final time to dust a portrait she would very likely never dust again, and pressed her cloth, without particular hope, along the lower edge of the frame where the canvas had twice before given slightly beneath her hand. It gave a third time, and this time, with nothing left to lose by looking closer, she looked. The backing had been cut and resewn, a neat line of stitches darker than the rest, low along the frame where a careless glance would take it for ordinary wear. Her fingers found the gap before her mind had finished deciding whether to search for one at all, and drew out, from between the canvas and its board, 2 folded sheets of paper gone soft with handling, sealed once and broken open since, in a hand she recognized from 100 household instructions the old Earl had left in his final year. She did not read them. She was a maid with a dismissal 3 days off and a family name already under suspicion of theft. And she understood, standing on that ladder with her heart going hard in her chest, exactly how it would look for the steward's disgraced daughter to be found removing papers from inside the late Earl's private portrait. She climbed down and carried the folded sheets the length of the gallery and the length of the corridor beyond it, without once loosening her grip on them, and went to find the one person in that house she trusted not to twist what she had found into another weapon against her family. She found Nathaniel in the library, still at his father's unfinished letter, and set the folded sheets on the desk before him without a word, because she found, at the moment it mattered most, that she had none steady enough to offer. He read in silence for a long time. Mercy stood before the desk with her hands folded tightly at her waist, watching his face change by degrees, from confusion to disbelief to something that looked, briefly, almost like grief, and understood before he spoke that whatever those pages held, they mattered enormously, and that her father's name was somewhere inside them. It was a codicil. In the old Earl's own hand, witnessed and dated the week before his death, restoring in full the Fenwick family's good name, recording plainly that a fuller review of the estate accounts had revealed the irregularities Vane reported the previous spring to be Vane's own doing, disguised behind a dead man's ledgers because a dead man could not answer the charge, and providing, further, a modest independence for Thomas Fenwick's surviving children in recompense for the injury done their father's memory. It named mercy directly. It asked, in the old Earl's own plain words, that whoever found it see that the wrong done a faithful servant was undone. "Where did you find this?" Nathaniel asked, very quietly, when he had read it twice. "Behind Lady Halworth's portrait, my lord," Mercy said. "I have dusted that frame every morning for 11 months, and never once thought to look beneath the canvas until today." He looked at her a long moment, at the maid who had climbed his gallery ladder daily without complaint, through a house that called her nothing, and said the first entirely unguarded thing he had said to her since the afternoon his arm caught her from a fall. "You found what my father died trying to finish saying," he said. "I think you have been the only honest person under this roof since I came home. Command as protection came first, before anything grander." "Sit down," he said, when he saw how badly her hands had begun to shake now that the papers were out of them. "Sit down and be still a moment. You have carried this the length of the house, and I do not think you have breathed properly since the gallery." She sat. He came around the desk and stood before her, close enough that she could see the fire's reflection caught in his eyes, and lifted one hand as though to brush a loosened strand of hair back from her face, the way he had reached for her arm on the icy step, and stopped himself then too. He stopped himself again now, his hand hanging a bare breath from her cheek, and she felt the warmth of it without the touch, and understood that he was holding himself back from something neither of them was yet free to finish. 3 days, she thought, with Vane's dismissal still ringing in her ears, and her father's vindication not yet a public fact. 3 days ago, she had been nothing. She could not let herself want, in this room, what a nobody had no business wanting from an earl. However his hand hovered, however her own breath had gone shallow and quick in her chest, he lowered his hand without touching her, and stepped back, and said, "Lo, that whatever else the codicil settled, it would settle first, in front of the whole house, before either of them said another word that could not afterward be unsaid." It was not wont to spare, she understood later. It was wont held deliberately in reserve, the way a man holds a thing too costly to spend carelessly, until the moment it could be spent in the open, where it would mean something, rather than merely feel like something. The reckoning came on Christmas Eve, in the same drawing room where Cordelia Fairfax had once called Mercy a girl one hardly noticed, before the same assembled company, because Nathaniel had asked his aunt to gather the household and the neighboring families for what he described only as a necessary correction to matters left unfinished by his father. Vane arrived expecting to discuss the marriage settlement. He found instead the family solicitor, Mr. Aldous Crane, summoned from the county town that morning, seated at the small table beside the hearth, with the codicil laid open before him, and its wax seal examined, and its witnesses' signatures already confirmed against the parish register. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He had learned, watching his father's unfinished letter and his own father's unfinished courage, exactly how much a quiet voice could carry in a silent room. He said that a codicil to his father's will had come to light, properly executed and witnessed, restoring the good name and modest independence of the late land steward's children, and that the accounting behind their father's supposed debts would be reopened under Mr. Crane's direct oversight, beginning with Mr. Vane's own management of the estate these 18 months past. Vane's composure did not survive that sentence intact. He began an explanation that faltered twice before it found its footing, and faltered a third time when Mr. Crane inquired, mildly, whether Mr. Vane could account for a series of entries in his own hand that postdated the old steward's death by several weeks. The room, which had gathered for a marriage announcement, watched instead a steward's careful fiction come apart in real time. And there is no cruelty quite so total as a room full of witnesses realizing together that they had believed the wrong man. Cordelia, seated near the fire in a gown the color of new money, understood the shape of the evening before her mother did, and rose with what dignity remained to her to say that she found the room grown suddenly close and would take the air, a retreat no one troubled to stop. Mercy stood near the door where she had been told to wait, in her one good dress rather than her apron, because Nathaniel had asked it of her that morning in a tone that brooked no argument, and felt the whole room's attention shift toward her the way it had once shifted away, and found she did not know what to do with being looked at properly for the first time in 11 months. Nathaniel crossed the room to her in perhaps 6 strides, the same unhurried certainty he had crossed the gallery with the day he caught her falling, and took her hand in front of the assembled company, in front of his aunt and his solicitor, and the county families who had laughed, mildly, at a joke about a nobody with a duster. "I choose Mercy Fenwick and no one else," he said. The silence that followed held for the length of 3 breaths before it broke into something warmer, his aunt's stiff face softening despite herself, Mrs. Prewitt's hand pressed hard against her own mouth, and Mercy stood very still in the middle of it, holding a hand she had not expected to be holding, and understood at last that nothing had been the wrong word all along. The house settled into its true shape slowly, the way houses do, through the ordinary business of correction, rather than any single dramatic hour. Vane departed Halworth Park before the new year, his management handed over entirely to Mr. Crane's oversight, and a steward of unimpeachable honesty engaged in his place. The Dowager Countess, who had spent a fortnight testing the new arrangement with pointed silences at dinner, found by January that she rather liked a granddaughter-in-law who remembered every tenant's name and never once put on airs she had not earned, and softened by degrees into something almost like warmth. Tom was given his own place at the estate schoolroom without needing to be smuggled in for it, and grew, over that winter, into a boy who no longer flinched when a door opened unexpectedly. He took to riding lessons with a fierce delight that reminded Nathaniel, he said once, of James at that age, and the saying of it cost him nothing of the old grief, only a quiet, settled affection that had room, finally, for both his brother's memory and a steward's son learning to sit a horse properly. Mercy no longer dusted the gallery each morning, though she visited it often, and stood sometimes a long while before the portrait that had kept her father's vindication folded in its frame for a year and a half, waiting for a hand patient enough to find it. She had asked once whether the painting ought to come down now that its secret was out of it. Nathaniel had said no. Some things, he told her, earned their place on a wall precisely because of what they had been trusted to hold. She thought of that answer often, in the months that followed, whenever she caught herself doubting that a maid's steady hands could be trusted with anything larger than a duster. The wedding was small, by the standards of a house that could easily have filled a cathedral, held in the estate chapel with snow still lying thin on the churchyard wall, and Mrs. Prewitt weeping openly in the second pew, and the Dowager Countess, to everyone's private astonishment, giving the bride away herself, her hand steady on Mercy's arm the length of the aisle, since her own father could not. On a snow-bright afternoon in February, walking the gardens with Nathaniel before their wedding, she found a small paper packet waiting on the stone bench where she always paused to catch her breath after the rose walk, tied with plain string, exactly the shape and weight of the sprig of dried lavender she had carried in her apron pocket every working day of the past year, the last living thing of her mother's garden she had left. She had thought the habit long since noticed, and long since forgotten. It had, apparently, been noticed rather more closely than she knew. Inside the packet lay a living lavender root, wrapped in damp cloth, ready for planting, with a note in Nathaniel's hand asking only that she choose where in the new garden it ought to grow, since the house, he wrote, was to be hers to shape from the ground up, not merely to keep. She planted it herself the following week, beneath the morning room window, where the light fell longest, and stood afterward with the last of the winter cold on her hands and the first green promise of spring not yet visible beneath the soil, and understood that some things, buried carefully enough by people who loved you, were never truly lost. They only waited for the right hand to find them, and the patience to dig. If Mercy's story moved you tonight, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it before you go. Thank you for staying until the end.